This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History Off the Page. I'm your host, Dr. Jason Hansen, and in today's episode, we'll be continuing our look at the Palestinian refugee experience of the 1950s, and in particular, we're actually going to look today at the international community's response to the situation, looking at what the United Nations did, seeing how they tried to alleviate the suffering of these Palestinian refugees, and to kind of solve the Palestinian refugee crisis. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, this is now our 16th episode on the history of the conflict. If you'd like to start at the beginning, you can find an overview of the series on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. We also have a range of episodes on other topics, ranging from the war in Ukraine, to the French and Russian revolutions, to the history of Christmas. It's all there, and you can find other information as well, including reading recommendations and ways to support our show. Okay. When we left off in our last episode, we had been talking about refugees' experiences, and we saw how different and varied they could be depending on the political circumstances, depending on the geographical location, and to some extent also depending on the economic background of the migrants themselves. If you recall, Jordan was probably the most desirable place to be. The Jordanians not only welcomed the refugees initially in terms of helping them with supplies, giving them sort of material support, things like that, but the Jordanian government actually also embraced the Palestinian refugees and tried to integrate them into Jordanian society. Right? As we said, by 1950, Palestinians who wanted Jordanian citizenship could get it, and that enabled them not only to receive benefits from the Jordanian state, to participate in Jordanian politics, but also to leave Jordan and go to places like Iraq where they could work in the oil fields. We saw how the Egyptian case was kind of a mixed bag, if you will, that the kind of area that these people are in Gaza was overwhelmingly kind of rural and poor. And then on top of it, you have about 3 to 4 times the number of refugees coming. And this created tremendous challenges, right? In terms of logistics, how do we get people food? How do we get people medicine? We talked about some of the ways that the Egyptian government and the international community, to some extent, tried to help those refugees. We also noted, however, that the Egyptian government didn't really want to absorb them, didn't really see them as potential future Egyptians. It was more kind of a temporary housing. We'll allow you to be here and we'll figure out what's going to happen later on down the road. Hopefully you'll actually go back to your homes and go back to Palestine. Finally, we talked about the Lebanese context and how this was the most difficult of the 3 situations we covered. The Lebanese government was very divided. The Lebanese sort of society, politics is very complicated because you have a minority Christian group in power. You had a substantial number of kind of Muslim minorities. So even within the Muslim community, divide between Shiites and Shia Muslims. We had other kind of minority like the Druze, the Alawites, right? So Lebanon is very complicated, very closely balanced. And then all of a sudden you have all of these refugees coming, and this makes it even more complicated. And so, as we said, the Lebanese situation was probably the worst. Palestinian refugees in Lebanon have very little rights. They don't even really get ID cards, especially not in the 1950s. It is an extremely difficult situation, and it's part of the reason that the Lebanese state has remained kind of complicated or problematic even to the present day. So all that we talked about in the previous episode. Today, what we're going to focus on is how did the international community, and in particular the United Nations, respond to the challenges of the refugee crisis? So as we saw, when the immediate outbreak of hostilities began in late 1947, the first responses to the crisis tend to come at the local level. right? When the refugees show up in Khan Yunis in Gaza, who are the people that are most immediately available to deal with that situation? It's the people that live in Khan Yunis. It's the people that live in Beirut. It's the people that live in Nablus. And so the first responses come mainly from Arab civilians and later Arab governments living in the areas where the refugees come and arrive at. And as we said, the responses of the Arab governments tended to vary. Outside of the Jordanian context, however, we need to underline that almost all Arab responses are predicated on a two-pronged approach or a two-pronged kind of understanding of the situation. First, there was obviously the need to deal with the immediate material needs of the refugees themselves. These people needed food, they need clothing, they need shelter. How do we get them the things that they need in order to survive? All of these things, however, are very temporary, right? We're talking about the moment, the immediacy. What do we do to solve the problem? In the more long-term kind of understanding of the issue, almost all of the Arab governments, again, with the exception perhaps of Jordan, want to work towards a diplomatic solution that ends with the return of the refugees to their homeland. Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, all of these countries want the final peace deal, whatever it's going to look like, to include the return of these refugees to their homelands. Or in some cases, they would actually say, before we can sit down and talk about a permanent peace settlement and what that looks like, all of our Arab brothers and sisters who are refugees need to be able to go home. They don't necessarily need to have power. You don't necessarily have to give them citizenship, but they need to go back to where they were. And then we won't have this problem anymore. We won't have this crisis. And, they'll be at least kind of taken care of to some respect. In a sort of conceptual way, all of that makes perfect sense, right? In a conceptual way, why should the Egyptians have to deal with all of these hundreds of thousands of refugees that are now in their territory? Why shouldn't that be the responsibility of the Israeli state? Why shouldn't, if we were going to have this partition, and okay, so, we had the war, but, now I guess both sides will accept the partition. Maybe there'll be some additional negotiations, but clearly we're going back to the partition. Clearly we're going back to there was supposed to be a Palestinian state, so shouldn't these people be allowed to go back because we're going to return or reset the clock and kind of fix all this? There's two problems, however, with this understanding of the situation. First, it is dependent on the Israelis taking the refugees back, and from the summer of 1948, the Israelis have made pretty clear they're not taking the refugees back. In fact, the longer the crisis went on, the more and more determined the Israelis became to never allow the refugees back, because they figure if we're going to have a Jewish state, how do we have 45% of the population be hostile to it? How do we have 45% of the population be people that said, well, we don't accept Israel's right to exist. We're going to fight. We're never going to allow it. We're going to drive it into the sea. Oh, okay, we lost, but now let us come back in and let us form, these enclaves in the state. Now, as we saw during the war, not all or even most Palestinians actually believe this, but the political leaders did. And so you can kind of understand why Israeli leaders were kind of nervous about this, why they had anxiety about it. Moreover, by the time you get into like 1950, 1951, those lands where these Palestinians lived are not just empty. The Israelis are taking the influx of Jewish refugees coming from various parts of the Middle East and North Africa, and they are resettling them on those lands where the Palestinians used to live. Whether you think that that was justified or not, it doesn't change the fact that there's no way to bring the Palestinian refugees back in unless you're now going to displace those Jewish refugees who then will have no place to go. And if you're creating a Jewish state that's supposed to look out for Jewish refugees, the idea that you're going to bend over backwards to accommodate people that you thought were your enemies at the cost of people that you're supposed to represent, that's just too much of a political burden to bear. There's too much of a contradiction there. It kind of, the whole idea of the Israeli state would have to invert itself. The second big issue, of course, is that the war doesn't really end. There is no permanent peace treaty that ends the first Arab-Israeli war. Instead, you have the armistice. And even when you have the armistice, there are still attacks going on across the border. You have these Fedayeen units. These are kind of Palestinian militiamen, and they're going to go cross over. They're going to attack, in some cases, Israeli settlements. You have actually a large number of refugees that say, damn it, I don't care what the Israeli state says. I miss home. I miss my crops. It's harvest time. You have a lot of refugees that try to return of their own, not for political reasons, not because they want to continue the conflict. They just want to go home. Eventually, you kind of get into this negotiating position where the Israelis say, we're not going to allow these refugees back without a permanent peace treaty, and then we can talk about it, and maybe we can let some back in. And the Arab states go, no, first you have to let them back in, then we do the final peace treaty. And so it kind of becomes a vicious cycle where, of course, the refugees are sadly kind of caught in the middle of it. Now, as this is all going on, the international community is aware. And so to solve the issue of material need, they first relied, as we talked about in the previous episode, on traditional institutions and groups that dealt with the idea of mass suffering. You're talking here about things like the International Red Cross, like the Red Crescent, like the American Quakers. And these are going to be some of the first groups to provide aid to people living in these refugee camps or emerging refugee camps in 1948. You also, of course, have the United Nations. The United Nations had recently been founded. They had actually just set up some organizations like UNICEF, which is the Emergency Children's Fund. You have things like the World Health Organization. And so in many ways, in the summer of 1948, the fall of 1948, these will be a kind of emergency, stopgap, kind of institutional response to the crisis. To try to better organize this, on November 19, 1948, UN Resolution 212 authorizes the creation of a special UN Relief for Palestine Refugees Agency. That's a mouthful to swallow. The abbreviation is UNRPR, and just trust me, there's a lot of abbreviations for these UN institutions that get set up. Basically, this UNRPR is designed to alleviate the situation for about a year. It is supposed to provide direct relief to the Palestinians until August of 1949, and it is also predicated on the notion that the solution to the Palestinian refugee crisis is wrapped up in the diplomatic solution to the first Arab-Israeli war. In other words, once you come up with a permanent peace treaty, all of the refugees will be able to go home and the problem won't exist anymore. To fund this, the United Nations authorizes an immediate $5 million contribution from its own resources, and then they're going to start raising money, and they hope to collect about $29 million for these refugees. Several weeks later, on December 11th, 1948, the United Nations passed Resolution 194, which tried to mandate a settlement to the Arab-Israeli conflict. This resolution creates another kind of entity. This was called the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, or UNCCP. And the idea was that this body would kind of continue the negotiating efforts, would move the ball along, and again try to get the two sides to agree to a peace treaty. One of the things, of course, that the UNCCP desires or calls for is the repatriation of refugees. And it basically stipulates if the refugees don't want to go back, then you have to offer them some kind of compensation for the land that you took away from them. To achieve these goals, the UNCCP organizes a series of negotiations at the Swiss city of Lausanne, starting in April of 1949. Now, the creation of the UN Commission is, on the surface, a laudable effort, but it's one of the challenges of making peace, right? If you want to do a peace deal, if you want to, create these treaties and these conflicts, as we've seen in Gaza, you have to have two sides that want to sit down and find a way towards peace. But that's not always the situation. Both sides don't necessarily come to it saying, how can we rationally get to a place where both you and I agree, and then we can just go on our separate ways? A second problem that can be involved or encountered in peace negotiations is the people doing the peace brokering have to be honest brokers. people talk about the idea of negotiating something of a treaty between Ukraine and Russia. Let's bring the whole Ukraine war to an end. Sounds great. Sounds very laudable on the surface. But the Ukrainians and the Russians have to feel like whoever is negotiating the deal is not looking out for their own interests. Is the negotiator really trying to help the two parties work something out? Or is the negotiator tired of war and tired of supporting one side or the other? And so they just want the conflict to end. And so that's what they're really negotiating for. When it came to the peace process with Israel-Palestine, the three negotiators come from the United States, from France, and from Turkey. And each of these negotiators is not just concerned of how do we end this war? People are suffering. There's violence. Oh, we don't like that. But they are also diplomats fulfilling the agendas of their own countries. For France, the biggest question going on in the Middle East at this point is, well, they've been driven out of Syria. They've been basically driven out of Lebanon. But their British rivals, who even though they're both on the same side in the Cold War, there's still a lot of tensions there. Their British rivals still seem to be sticking around. And in particular, the British still have this close relationship with Abdullah in Jordan. And so the French are kind of like, well, we don't want whatever this solution is to benefit the Jordanians too much. The Turks, on the other hand, are really worried about a Soviet invasion of Turkey. They are trying to create this kind of diplomatic network of Arab and Muslim states. Turkey's not an Arab state, it's a Muslim state. But trying to create this kind of consortium of Middle Eastern states that are going to, fight back against communism. And so they are trying to get their Arab neighbors on board and look, kind of favorably to their Arab neighbors. They want their Arab neighbors to look, we want to work with Turkey. We want to have close relations. Again, let's forget about that whole Ottoman period, when we didn't get along so well. The United States, of course, has kind of complicated motivations. Obviously, the Cold War is going on. They're anti-Soviet. There is also the kind of, after the Holocaust, the American Jewish community becomes very pro-Zionist, as it is today. And so, electorally speaking, politicians are thinking about, well, I got to be careful of the Jewish vote here in the United States. We want to kind of be a little bit more pro-Israel. Finally, one last mistake that they make is that they will only meet with the Arab side with all of the Arabs together as opposed to one country kind of one-on-one. So it's very hard, for example, even if you had someone in Syria, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, or wherever, even if you had someone that came out and said, hey, I really care about peace. Let's just have a deal. Let's get these Palestinians a homeland. Then the refugees can go there, and maybe the Israelis will give them a little bit more territory. You can't do that if you're the only one saying it in front of all the other Arab delegates. Because the political game, the political posture is that as an Arab state, you have to be completely pro-Palestine, and that means being anti-Israeli. You can't come out and admit that you want to do a deal with the Israelis because then you look weak. You look like the one that everybody should gang up against to show how pro-Palestinian they are and how much Arabs around the rest of the Middle East should respect you. Incidentally, I got asked this at a dinner party on Friday night, so I just want to clarify this. Why is it so popular to be anti-Israeli? A lot of it, I would argue, doesn't really have to do with anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism, but it has to deal with being anti-colonial. For a lot of Arabs, the 1940s and 50s, and of course the decades beforehand, are about resistance to colonization, resistance to European imperialism. And so for them, the story of 1948 is the last act of European colonization. Israel is a European state. Israel is full of Europeans, is the way that they think about it. And so resisting Israel, getting rid of Israel, is a step towards decolonization of the Arab world. As I said, all this complicates the situation in these negotiations. The Egyptians and the Jordanians have this tremendous rivalry. The Jordanians are trying to gain control of parts of Palestine. The Egyptians are trying to block them because they don't want them to grow and become more powerful, and again increase the rivalry between the Jordanians and the Egyptians. And again, as I said before, the Israelis also are not coming to the table saying, how do we get back to 1947 and do a partition deal everyone can accept? The Israelis are creating a reality on the ground that they want to see and making it impossible for anyone to sort of change it. Now, it's not baked in stone at this point, or it's not a done deal at this point, but when the conference begins, we are headed in that direction. Israel offers in May of 1949, as part of this kind of feeling out of what a post-war Middle Eastern state will look like, they actually offer to annex Gaza and to accept the people living in Gaza as Israeli citizens. How genuine this offer was is something that is debated. What would have happened to these Gazans once they were in Israel? Would they have been allowed to stay in Gaza, or would they have been kind of internally deported or internally displaced into the Negev desert, which is not a really fun place to live, as you might imagine? This is something the Egyptians speculate. But this proposal basically goes nowhere. Again, hindsight being 2020, even if they had done it, would it have worked? Israel takes over Gaza in 1967, doesn't really seem to improve the situation. And so that suggestion kind of fizzles out. Another offer that's sometimes talked about in the historical literature is this offer that the Israelis come up with, in part because of American pressure in the summer of 1949, to accept 100,000 Palestinian refugees back into Israel. However, the Israelis, again, they're not necessarily, I don't want to say not negotiating in good faith, but they're not trying to figure out from a rational, dispassionate, objective standpoint, how do we, put the pieces together to have complete peace in the region? They are trying to fulfill their own goals in terms of creating a Jewish state. And so one of the things with this offer of accepting 100,000 Palestinian refugees without Gaza is that it's on the condition that Arabs and Israelis make a complete peace treaty, that Arab states recognize Israel's right to exist. And in the end, it's just too much of a political pill to swallow. It's just too difficult for Arab political leaders to say, we will recognize Israel's right to exist, just as it is impossible for Israeli politicians to turn around and say, okay, we will actually allow 100, 200, in a perfect world, 700,000 of these refugees back into Israel. There is no Israeli politician in 1948 or 49 that could have accepted that deal and survived. To bring this back to the question of the refugees in the immediate moment, as opposed to just this abstract ideal of refugees, by the late summer of 1949, it started to dawn on all the different parties that a final peace settlement was unlikely, or that at least it would not be achieved in the near future. And so this idea of just directly supporting the refugees, of giving them, food, of giving them clothing, of paying for volunteer teachers and things like this, that's not a long-term solution. You can't just continually support 200,000 people living in Gaza with no jobs. And so UN planners start to turn towards the idea of permanently integrating the Palestinian refugees into their host states' local economies. They start to conceive of this not as a specifically Israeli, Arab, or Israeli-Palestinian problem, but they start to look at this in terms of economic development. What if we could not just deal with the issue of poverty and the refugees, but what if that could be the key to unlocking the resolution to poverty across the Middle East? What if we start to view these refugees less as people who are suffering and people who are in need, but what if we start to look at them in a kind of cold, economic, rational way as resources? What if we can economically modernize the entire Middle East and bring peace and prosperity and obviously wealth? Wouldn't that create stability in the Middle East? Towards this end, on August 23, 1949, the UNCCP established the Economic Survey Mission, or the ESM, to begin planning a series of public works projects that could both improve local economies while also soaking up the refugee population and giving them their own resources to be able to escape the cycle of poverty caused by displacement. Isn't this a win-win for everybody involved? Isn't this, if you're playing billiards, isn't this the trick shot where you hit like 6 balls in one shot? Because, of course, if the Middle East economically modernizes, then the United Nations doesn't have to keep paying for all these programs to support these refugees, and those countries get to keep more of their money and spend it on whatever they want to. In December 1949, the ESM released its first proposed relief projects. It said, okay, we're not going to go too big to start with, but let's have some basic pilot projects. Let's do some small stuff that can show the power of modernization. It'll alleviate some of the refugee crisis. These are, to use a term from American politics, shovel-ready jobs. If you remember that from the Obama years from 2010. So they come up with these 4 pilot projects that are going to, again, help the refugee crisis. 3 of the 4 involve the idea of constructing dams along what are known as wadi. Wadi are basically dry channels that only fill with water during the rainy season. If you've driven out west, if you've been across like Arizona, a lot of times you'll see these kind of dry creeks, dry riverbeds. Only when there's a big storm do they fill up with water. Well, if you leave these kind of wadi to their natural state, you get the water at the time that it rains, but there's a lot of surplus water and that just kind of runs off into the desert. And so basically the arable land is only the land directly where this flooding happens at the time of the rain. So these modernization experts say, well, what if we dammed the wadi? What if we kind of created a reservoir? So instead of all that water just kind of running away, we can store it. We can use it for later use. We can use it to irrigate additional lands. We can make more arable land, make more food. If we make more land available, then that's more jobs. And guess what? These refugees that are here, what are they experts in? It's not global finance. It's not engineering, but it is how to grow crops. And so if you start to make more arable land, more of these people can be permanently employed. They'll be able to produce crops. They'll be able to sell the crops. They'll have more to eat. This is a big win-win. Even better, if you're going to dam these wadi up, you've got to build the dams. And to build the dams, you got to build roads. And to build roads, you have to quarry all the materials. And once you built the dams and you've got the roads, we have to forestate it because you don't want erosion. So these UN planners start talking about the idea of building brand new villages in a variety of geographical contexts that are going to be populated mainly by these refugees. And in time, maybe they can even move away from cereal farming. Let's start growing crops that are more valuable, more lucrative, like cotton or sugarcane or fruit. We saw at the very beginning of this series on Israel-Palestine, one of the things that the Jewish refugees do in the 19-teens and 20s is they start harvesting citrus crops. Now, the 4th project is a little bit more involved. They want to dam and build a hydroelectric station along the Litani River in Lebanon. And so again, by the time you get to the late 1949, early 1950, United Nations relief experts start to say, yeah, look at all these things we can do. This is the way forward. Let us concentrate not on ending the war and returning the refugees, but on public works projects to make their lives better in the long run. And so to help coordinate all these efforts, the United Nations, surprise, surprise, creates a new agency to deal with the situation on December 8th, 1949. Known as the United Nations Works and Relief Agency for Palestine, or UNRWA, it becomes the principal agency responsible for dealing with the Palestinian refugees. If you follow the news today, of course, you know that has continued to the present day. There are about 6 million Palestinian refugees who receive support from UNRWA, or at least did before the start of the war in 2023. You may also see criticisms of UNRWA. There is some indication that some members of UNRWA were either complicit or actively involved in the October 7th attacks. In some ways, that's not surprising because UNRWA does hire a lot of local people, a lot of Palestinian refugees. And we'll talk about how it got to the point where it is today, where it has this kind of relief role, but a lot of that relief is direct relief again. So we'll get back to that in a second. but we got to work through the history to understand why. Basically, at the time of its creation at the end of 1949, UNRWA is supplied with a generous budget of $54 million, and it comes into operation in May of 1950. Now, initially, again, its main role is direct relief. A lot of that $54 million initially will be spent on supplies. Right? We thought the war was going to end in 1949. We thought the refugees would go home. That didn't happen. Right? So the new UN agency will take over that mission of supplying material supplies, again, to the Palestinian refugees. But it also, again, begins to focus on these broader projects. Right? Alongside the ESM, it starts to think about what are some small-scale projects that we can do that will help involve training and employment. I mentioned before in Gaza, one of the things that gets done is that they create this textile factory. Let's teach the people there how to weave textiles. Let's teach the people there how to run a factory. And that's jobs, and that's relief. They'll be better. We talked about the Wadi dams that they had thought about in 1949. Well, they, again, come up with this idea of extending this. Let's do road building. Let's do tree planting. They partially subsidize some refugees who want to move abroad. And the fourth thing they want to do finally is that they want to start to do this large-scale projects. Let's do TVA on steroids for the Middle East, and this will be the solution to the refugee crisis. Now, these planners were a little optimistic. They thought that after just 18 months, they could totally alleviate and finish off the refugee crisis, that these refugees would all be living lives well out of the camps, that the situation could be resolved very quickly. Needless to say, this doesn't quite work. By 1952, UNRWA began to conclude that the first three ideas, they're simply too small in order to kind of permanently solve these refugee issues. And so they therefore turned their focus mainly to the fourth issue, which again was this idea of not just public works projects in general, but big public work projects. For example, one scheme was to build a power station and an irrigation system on the Yarmouk River on the Syrian-Jordanian border. The basic idea was they were going to build a canal from a nearby reservoir, they were going to have it drop over 800 feet, and then use another canal to take it to the Dead Sea, where there could be another power station. And of course, along the way, you can siphon off water for irrigation, you can create farms, and UN authorities projected this 160,000 acres of new farmland that was to be opened up. Now, we'll talk about some specific examples of these projects in just a moment, but before we get there, we really need to underline one of the fundamental problems of the UN's efforts. Basically, it tended to ignore the human or the psychological dimensions of the Nakbah. It treated these refugees like they were, again, statistics in a flowchart or on some kind of graph, or, they're just kind of a reservoir, not as human beings. Displacement is not only something that is an economic disruption. To become a refugee doesn't just mean you lose your job. It also means being taken away, as we said, from your home, from your land, from your community. And it's very hard for refugees to look at that situation and just say, well, okay, I'm in Gaza now. I used to live in Jaffa. I used to live in Tel Aviv. I was in Haifa, loved living in Haifa, but now I'm here. I'm just stuck and I'm ready to move on. You will find refugees that do that. I talked to a Syrian refugee in Berlin in 2017. He's a really fascinating guy, and he was like, no, I'm gone. I'm never going back. Curious, obviously, given what's happened today and yesterday, what this guy might say today, but he said, no, my future is in Germany. It's time to adjust, right? But that's hard to do. That's the exception, one could argue, to the rule. The Palestinian refugees in 1948, 49, even up to the present day, one could argue, they don't want to adjust to or accept these new geographical realities. They want to go home. And home isn't just a building. It's not just food and a job. Home is a place. Home is a culture. Home is a familiarity. So the idea that you're going to get them to participate in these large public work projects to potentially permanently resettle them in a foreign country, these actions implied or required Palestinian refugees to essentially give up on the dream of return. To put this more directly, it meant abandoning the idea in some ways of having a Palestine. And for many, many refugees, this was simply too bitter of a pill to swallow. Maybe today there would be more Palestinian refugees who might accept it. Maybe. But to be a first-generation refugee, to have the experience of a home that you knew and to have it ripped away from you, and then to have some UN bureaucrat just say, well, just move to Sinai. Just move. It's the same. Arabs are Arabs. The desert's the desert. It's all the Middle East. It's all the same. For better or worse, people have a very real and in many ways almost permanent attachment to a home. And to lose that home, even when they lose it a lot of times, they still maintain this desire or in their minds project the sense of, yes, one day I will go home. You look at German refugees that are kicked out of Poland after World War II, obviously a lot of history and context to that. They still refer to those towns by their German names. They still talk about Breslau. They don't talk about Wrocław. The place still exists in their minds, and they just can't let go of the idea of one day returning. And so again, for many of these refugees, they just are not willing or not psychologically prepared to make the sacrifices in terms of place that the works project directors are assuming. One of the best places to see this process play out is in one of the UN's largest schemes, which envisioned the resettlement of tens of thousands of Gazan refugees into the Sinai Peninsula. Now, from the UN perspective, this makes sense, right? There's a lot of reason for this. Gaza, as we saw, was a problem. Gaza, there were 200,000 refugees. This is in a relatively small space. There are no resources in Gaza in terms of natural resources. There are no opportunities for works projects. The idea of building a works project in Gaza that then would become an independent Palestine, it just, economically speaking, doesn't make sense. So the UN planners became fixated on the idea of resettling, again, large numbers of these Palestinian refugees elsewhere. In 1950, UNRWA began negotiations with the Egyptian government to move the refugees to Sinai. After the Free Colonel's seizure of power in 1952, the politics of this become more feasible. The colonels were trying to modernize Egypt. They wanted international money. One of the things we'll talk about when we get to Suez is the Aswan High Dam project. And so these colonels are thinking, well, if the United Nations wants to pay for this, they want to build a bunch of farms and irrigation systems in Sinai. They want to build a canal to bring water from the Nile to the desert. They're going to put people there who are Arabs, who are desperate for work, who are going to work hard, who are going to give us food that we can then use in Egypt or sell abroad. Well, I don't know. Maybe this isn't such a terrible idea. Maybe we should think about it. The problem, of course, is that the solution runs headlong into the politics of the right to return. Once resettled, the Palestinian refugees were unlikely to ever go back to Palestine. Again, using another maybe more familiar European example, how many of the Irish refugees that came over during the potato famine in the middle of the 19th century, in the 1840s, how many Irishmen went back to Ireland after it was over? How many of them made a living, started to move up the social ladder in New York City, and then in the 1870s were like, well, I'm moving back to Ireland? There were probably some that did it, but it's not the large number. It's not the bulk of the population. When UN officials approached Palestinians living in Gaza as refugees about this scheme in the early 1950s, the Palestinians began by organizing a campaign against it. They explicitly say, we don't want to give up the idea of a return to Palestine. One guy that's writing about it actually says, this is kind of like the plight of the Jews under Moses. We need to wander around in the desert for 40 years in order to get back to Palestine. becoming someone who lives in Sinai, becoming an Egyptian, doesn't get us home. The initial opposition to this Sinai project really starts in 1953, but it comes to a head in 1955, shortly after Israeli forces struck the Al-Barej camp in Gaza in retaliation for the killing of an Israeli civilian in Tel Aviv by a Fedayeen. Fedayeen is basically a Palestinian resistance fighter, as I mentioned, a kind of militiaman, some people would say terrorist. They would cross the border and attack targets in Israel. The refugees living in Gaza start to put two and two together, or at least in their minds it's 2 and 2, and they start to say, look, the Egyptians aren't defending us against the Israelis because the Egyptians really actually want us to go and live in Sinai. The Egyptians and the Israelis are actually working together, is the kind of conspiracy theory. And so the refugees start to turn, ironically enough, against the Egyptians. On March 1st, 1955, during a protest against the Sinai resettlement plan, Egyptian soldiers opened fire on the demonstrators, killing one Palestinian. And of course, as often happens in history, once this kind of overreaction happens, the protests spread. Protesters began burning Egyptian cars. They began sacking UN aid offices. They actually formed an official Supreme National Committee which negotiated with the Egyptian government about the Sinai resettlement plan. The chief demands that they had were, number one, obviously canceling the resettlement project. Number two, they said, you need to start arming Palestinians to protect us from the Israelis. We Palestinians don't want to rely on the Egyptian government to do it. We are going to do it ourselves. They also demanded civil rights for refugees living in the Gaza Strip and justice for those who were shot by the Egyptian government. Now, the Egyptian government responds to this with a little bit of underhanded kind of carrot and stick. Initially, they sort of say, okay, these are all very reasonable demands, and so they accept them. And then the next night, on March 8th to the 9th, the Egyptian military moves in and crushes the revolt. They lock up the leaders of it. They break up the political infrastructure that the Palestinians had tried to form. And eventually, of course, the government decides to drop this idea of resettlement. Instead, it starts to say, well, okay, we really don't want to be seen as being pro-Israeli or friendly with the Israelis. And so the best way to sort of shift course here is to go from trying to keep the Palestinians from attacking the Israelis and engendering potentially more hostilities to arming them and training them and directing this kind of militant, violent energy in a productive direction from the Egyptian standpoint. By the mid-1950s, UNRWA began to see all this happening and said, okay, we have to shift our focus once more. Instead of these large public works projects and integration into local economies, momentum in terms of how to deal with the situation swung once more back in the direction of direct aid. If the refugees would not or could not go elsewhere, then the most important thing was to give them better facilities where they were. And so UNRWA began to step up their kind of direct relief efforts, the kind of most immediate investment in terms of infrastructure. They began to fund the construction of more permanent housing. They will start installing asbestos because, again, in the 1950s, people thought that was a good idea, didn't understand the cancer aspect of it. As this process plays out, once again, there is actually quite a bit of hostility from the refugees. They don't want a permanent house because a permanent house means I'm never going home. The UN also began to emphasize more vocational training, self-support, primary education, healthcare, and again, continued direct supplies and relief for the most needy refugees. And this becomes the kind of blueprint for UNRWA operations going forward. Last thing I'll say about this is there's one other small kind of tweak that they do starting after the mid-1950s, early 1960s. They start to realize that the idea of only aiding Palestinian refugees while ignoring the suffering and plight of other Gazans, other people in other parts of the Middle East, this is going to be problematic. And so at least in Gaza in particular, they will erase the distinction between refugee and non-refugee Palestinians. This becomes even more so the case after 1967 and the Six-Day War. This is an interesting example. Right now, you're seeing a lot of hostility in Israel to UNRWA. again, these accusations of complicity in October 7th, after the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel is more than happy to have UNRWA working in Gaza. Right? They're welcome. They're seen as a resource. They're seen as part of the solution at that time. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself by talking about the 1960s. Basically, in the end, as we can kind of wrap this up, the Palestinians do have more permanent shelters built. If you go to one of these camps today, it looks much more, again, like a town, like you have apartment complexes and things like that. It is not so much the kind of tent slums that one might imagine. As always, however, this kind of also has a kind of consequence that is unintended. One of the things that happens is as you make the refugee camps more attractive, as you pour investment into them, they become more desirable than the non-subsidized housing outside of them. And so one of the things that actually happens is you have poor non-refugee people in places like Gaza that will move back into, or initially into, the refugee camps and begin to actually, in some cases, rent shelters from some enterprising refugees. If I get the ability to kind of buy my way out of the refugee camp, the place that I still was, the dwelling that I was in, it still has value. And so I can actually rent that out to someone who's poor, who may or may not be a refugee. And so the whole system becomes very complicated and very problematic and very difficult to administer. By 1958, we can conclude that what had started as a temporary form of relief basically evolves into what is in essence a permanent village, and in many cases, sadly, is still what it is today. Right? UNRWA is still supplying this kind of basic humanitarian assistance and humanitarian aid that keeps the population alive, but doesn't really break it out of poverty or break it out of subsistence level of life. Okay, to kind of wrap things up, today the legacies of the 1948 displacement continue to play a monumental role in the continuing conflict in the region. Over 1.5 million Palestinians continue to live in 58 UNRWA-supported refugee camps strung out across Gaza, the West Bank, and other Israeli neighbors. The camps themselves have evolved into small towns, or in some cases simply been allowed to be swallowed up by the urban growth of major cities like Beirut. Conditions in the camps do tend to vary, but on the whole are generally poor, crowded, and underfunded. They have perpetuated one of the central problems of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the lack of Palestinian agency and more generally of a place for Palestinians to identify a future. Instead, this kind of political and economic purgatory has nurtured movements such as Hamas that seek to create that future through the use of violence. And we'll see that one of the things that happens after 1967 is that Palestinians no longer are content to let the Arab states be the ones who are going to solve the crisis and kind of reconstitute Palestine. They will try to take matters into their own hands, and the primary strategy for doing that is asymmetrical warfare or terrorism. It's two sides of the same coin. Because they turned to this use of violence after 1967, and there was already some of it before 1967, to be honest, the cycle of violence would continue over and over, generation after generation, even up until the present day. Palestinians resist the permanence of 1948, while Israelis continue to try to defend it. There have been many moments, as I said, when we can see this cycle of violence playing out, and we'll examine a fairly major one in our next episode when we discuss the Suez Crisis in 1956. But that will be for a future podcast episode. As always, I'd like to thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast or found it useful, please mention us on social media or rate the show on Apple or Spotify. You can also find links to the various episodes on our website, www.historyoffthepage.com. That's our show. Hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.